Israel says it's imposing a daily 10-hour pause on military activity in parts of Gaza to allow for greater aid delivery into the enclave. It comes amid growing scrutiny and anger over Israel's actions there. The IDF announced yesterday over 120 aid trucks were collected and distributed, with another 180 trucks set to enter the enclave. In a social media post on Saturday, Israel's foreign ministry denied Palestinians are being starved and instead accused Hamas of spreading propaganda using manipulated images. The United Nations says nearly 1 in 3 Gazans hasn't eaten for days. World Health Organization data shows 63 malnutrition-related deaths in July alone, nearly half of them children. Israel blames the UN for failing to distribute aid while vowing to continue its fight against Hamas. And in Scotland, President Trump was asked yesterday if he believes Israel should be doing more to allow that food into Gaza.
Well, you know, we gave $60 million 2 weeks ago, and nobody even acknowledged it for food. And it's terrible. You know, you really at least want to have somebody say thank you. No other country gave anything. We gave $60 million 2 weeks ago for food for Gaza. And nobody acknowledged it. Nobody talks about it. And it makes you feel a little bad when you do that.
Joining us now, retired CIA officer Mark Polymeropoulos. He's an MSNBC national security and intelligence analyst. I have to say, as we were listening to the president there and his ask that people say thank you when the U.S. gives aid in situations like this does call to mind the way that he talked about Ukraine. And, of course, that situation with Zelensky in the Oval remains indelible, I think, in many of our minds. But speaking specifically about Gaza, it does feel in the last few days like yet again we've reached a fever pitch. But does this actually change anything? Because this situation on the ground has been so heartbreakingly bad for so long.
Well, Ali, images matter, and what the world saw were pictures of starving children.
Yeah.
This was too much, even for some of Israel's closest allies, both in Europe and the United States as well. I'm sure there was pressure from Washington being put on Jerusalem, and in fact, there's reports that the Israeli embassy here in Washington realized that a diplomatic catastrophe was happening. But the bottom line is that this was a deliberate Israeli policy of starvation, something, first of all, the U.S. would never do.
Yeah.
And two things. One is the immorality of that. But number two is it didn't work. You know, the war is not over. The hostages have not returned, and we're still at this impasse. And whether you blame Hamas for this or the Israeli government, the bottom line is people are starving in Gaza. And the world finally actually said, no, that's enough.
Because I think there's the political conversation that's being had at diplomatic levels of how do we get to a ceasefire, how do we get the hostages back? And then there's the public pressure campaign that, frankly, has been sustained over the course of the last year plus as people have seen these images coming out of Gaza. What is the impact of that from a public sentiment perspective as it then applies to American support for Israel? You and I were talking about this during the break.
Sure. You know, someone like myself, I worked in the U.S. national security infrastructure, very close to the Israelis over the years. You know, in my generation, it's almost baked in that the U.S. supports Israel. But that's not the case because there's outrage, especially in the United States amongst youth. And the polling shows certainly amongst Democratic youth, but also Republicans as well. So this is a really big issue for the Israelis, for the Israeli foreign ministry. I mean, all the kind of the sympathy after October 7th seems to have evaporated. Yeah. And they have a long way to go because of policies, actually, of the Israeli government to regain that support. And I don't think this is something that's necessarily going to be sustained if, of course, Israel continues on with not only the civilian casualties from Gaza, but also with a policy of starvation. I mean, the morality of this or the immorality is pretty jarring.
Yeah, it's definitely jarring. And I think those images are and have been having a sustained effect on the political side of this. I want to stay on that side of the equation for a second, because when you see the fact that the top diplomat for the U.S., Steve Witkoff, was pulling out negotiators, he's blaming Hamas for this stalemate in a ceasefire talk. You see Republican legislators on the Hill also blaming Hamas. There is a lot of focus there. Is that where the roadblock actually is, based on what you're seeing and hearing from the region?
Well, first of all, Hamas is, somewhat to blame.
Yeah.
Clearly, they actually can see that there's no reason for them to make a deal. They don't care about the suffering of the Palestinian people, and they see kind of diplomatic outrage pointed at Israel. But of course, the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu has plenty to share in terms of blame as well. And one of the things that is somewhat notable, perhaps, is the Knesset. The Israeli parliament is in recess now. So perhaps there would be more of a way in which Netanyahu can end the war. And look, at the end of the day, what you need is an all-for-all deal. That's the hostages come out, the war is over, period. The Israeli military and intelligence officials that one speaks to privately think their goals have been satisfied. But again, is this the case where Prime Minister Netanyahu just has to try to survive? Bottom line is kids are starving in Gaza. Not a good situation.
Yeah, that is 100% the bottom line here. Mark Polymeropoulos, thank you for getting us up to date in the region.